Well, thank you so much for everyone for attending this evening. I've got a couple of housekeeping items. So when we're going to go through the presentation and then we're going to take any questions that you may have. Please place your questions in the Q&A section, not in the chat. You'll see the Q&A section at the bottom, and we will answer them in the order that they are received. We will also place links to our story map, which has our survey and places for you to comment towards the end of the presentation. And any comments that you would like to have captured should be placed in that story map survey. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So with me this evening is myself. I'm Janet Gear. I'm one of the project managers on the City of Bothell side. With me as well is Amanda Royal. She's co-managing the project with me. And Christy Cox, who was just on, is our Education and Outreach Surface Water Program Coordinator, and she's helping with some of the outreach efforts. And then we have Rose from Jacobs, who is the project manager and our lead on the consultant side. So the purpose of the meeting this evening is to present the 4 design alternatives, to summarize our selection process for the preferred alternative, including our criteria and our scoring, to gather any feedback, comments, questions, and then to share next steps and other opportunities for engagement going forward. So a project overview for you. So just project orientation here. These are the 3 park areas that we have within this location, and there's about 89 acres between the what the former front 9 and back 9, the east side and west sides of the former Wayne Golf Course, and then we've got Blythe Park as well. These all include active use, passive use, and then salmon habitat conservation areas. What we're focusing on is this east side of the former Wayne Golf Course this evening. That has 31 acres that have been specifically set aside for salmon habitat restoration. The area that's kind of carved out right here, this was carved out for passive use. And so that is outside of the project area. This does include over 1,000 linear feet of the Sammamish River bank. And then just so you know, in our project area, we've stuck with the lowland spide because this forested area is heavily sloped and it has highly erosive soils. So we're going to try to just maintain that and not disturb it as much as possible. So the goal of this project is specifically to restore and enhance salmon habitat along the Sammamish River and Waynita Creek, which is a tributary to the Sammamish River within the east side of the property. So just giving you a little history here. Early on in the property acquisition phase, we worked with King County, Forterra, and the city folks to create a very conceptual designs with the King County fish biologists, scientists, and project managers. So once we went into this phase, we started looking at the historic data of the area. And what you're looking at is a map from 1871. And what we were focused on here is this is where the project is actually located. And we wanted to see what was here before the Ballard Lock installation when they dropped the river by 9 feet. And so what you see here is that this is Waynita Creek, and there's a single confluence point here. And just points of reference for the map, these little slash lines, those are slopes. So this is that hillside that we're talking about. And then these little, they look like plants. This is marshland wetland area. So this is what it looked like prior to the Ballard Lock installation. And then when we had that information, we wanted to see what was there before the golf course, and mainly because there are 2 unnamed tributaries that come down from the hillside, and we wanted to properly connect them where they were previously. And so what you can see here is from the King County IMAP system in 1936, and that's prior to the golf course installation. And what we could see was that these 2 tributaries came together, and then they made their way to Waynita Creek. And so with those, you'll see those come out in the design alternative concepts. The next thing that we started to look at was habitat features specifically for Chinook, because that's where the grant funding came from for this effort. And so we're going to focus on the confluence of Waynita and the Sammamish River to provide habitat and reconnecting with those tributaries and the groundwater on site where possible to provide cold water refuge. The goal is for all of these options proposed to have a high probability of success in order to function under the existing site conditions. And what I mean by that is we're not likely to remove the Ballard locks and raise the Sammamish River by 9 feet again. So we talked to the consultants and made sure that any of the concept designs that are put forward would function under the existing site conditions. The next thing that we looked at and we continue to work on is regional efforts and constraints with the site. So for example, the Sammamish River banks are maintained as a levee system with Army Corps. And because Army Corps dictates the river levels, we're gonna make sure we're coordinating closely with them, with the flood district, because they're in the process of updating the operations and maintenance manual for the Sammamish River corridor. We'll be talking to surrounding jurisdictions. And then we're gonna be looking at the funding opportunities for construction. For example, this is going to be, pretty much completely grant funded. So any project alternative that's chosen will only move forward if we have grant funding to support the work. The next thing we started to take a look at was existing site conditions. So the project area here, what you're looking at is we completed a cultural resource survey. Then we went through a full wetland delineation, and what they found was 5 wetland areas, which you can see denoted on the map here. And then this one little dotted area here needs to be looked at in the spring. So we have 5 with a potential for 6 on site. And then we completed some topographic surveys and stream studies on site. The city did install groundwater monitoring wells 2 years ago, and so we've been capturing that data because it's very important for us to understand where we can intercept groundwater on site. And then we use the soil data, both from the groundwater borings, so that we have a good idea of the layers and where they're changing and how we can create that hyporheic exchange that's very important to the project effort. This also shows some of the other constraints and the easements on site. So for example, there is the King County Regional Trail, and that was put in as part of the property acquisition. And so while we aren't going to be doing anything with the trail, we're not going to be installing it as part of this project or any of the efforts outside of the salmon habitat restoration, we do need to know where it's going to go so that we can properly design the project. And so what you're looking at here, this light green is the King County Regional Trail. This dotted area is where it's currently located within the easement. And you'll see in some of the alternatives where we've looked at possibly connecting it into the passive use area because it cannot function here under one of the alternatives. And then the other, again, this is that passive use area that's outside of the project scope. And for folks that were interested in potentially putting something on site here, I'll draw your attention to this white triangle. This is the only area within the project that is outside of any of the stream and wetland buffers. And so if there was something to be installed on site, this would be the place to do it right here. Okay. So engagement opportunities. We conducted stakeholder interviews in June through September. We met with groups like King County, Raya 8, the Fish and Wildlife. We met with local groups, One Bothell and Whale Scouts. We also met with the Parks Board and with City Council in order to engage and answer some questions for the concept development. And now in November, we've gone through another round of those stakeholder briefings to explain the alternatives. We'll be going through those throughout November. And then we've also got the month-long outreach effort, which is that story map I'm alluding to. It's an online open house, and that just gives everybody 30 days to review all the information, look at the alternatives, provide any comments that they would like to have registered. And then we'll go through the process in December of bringing that to council for hopefully a decision where we're hoping that they'll make a decision by January so that we can move forward into preliminary design. And just a caveat, again, as these engagement opportunities continue, the preferred alternative may shift based on feedback received. So getting into the project alternatives. So under alternative 1, there are 3 major restoration areas or elements to this alternative. We're going to restore vegetation within the riparian areas. We're going to daylight those 2 tributaries I talked about earlier that go into Waynita Creek. And then we'll do some limited restoration of Waynita Creek, including placing of large woody debris and stream bed sediment to improve surface water and groundwater exchange. Under this scenario, all invasive vegetation species would be removed during restoration. And though the native plants have not been chosen yet, the goal would be to provide a forested corridor between the Sammamish River and the upslope areas off-site. Alternative 2. So Alternative 2 has all the elements of Alternative 1, and then it has what explores what a side channel would look like along the Sammamish River. The placement and the length of the side channel mimics how a side channel would look if naturally formed based on the curvature of the Sammamish River stream bed. Alternative 3 also builds on Alternative 1 by exploring what widening at the Waynita Creek confluence with the Sammamish River could look like. Adding multiple channels provides more opportunity for off-channel habitat along the Sammamish River during high flows, and then during low flows, at least one of those channels would have flow year-round. Alternative 4. So Alternative 4 has all the elements from 1 and 3 included, and it also adds an alcove channel to provide more benefit along the Sammamish River. The alcove channel would be designed to contain flows year-round, with opportunities for floodwaters from the Sammamish River to backfill this area during high flows, and then providing additional refuge areas for salmon. Like Alternative 1, all the remaining riparian areas would be restored with native vegetation, and those 2 tributaries would be daylighted. So identifying the preferred alternative. To identify the preferred alternative, we developed a criteria matrix based on environmental, social, technical, and financial goals and values. Each alternative was scored using a matrix with a value of 0 to 3 applied to each criteria. A score of 0 indicated a fatal flaw, a score of 1 was the least desirable, and a score of 3 was the most desirable. And then we allowed half points as well during the calculations. The recommendation for the preferred alternative was the alternative with the highest score based on scoring completed by the team. Each aspect of this is very important, but the financial component is the most important since substantial grant funding is needed in order to move this project forward. City Council will ultimately determine which alternative move forward to the next stage of design based on our analysis, the public feedback, and an independent review. So Alternative 1, this one has the least amount of grading and in-stream improvements along Waynita Creek and the Sammamish River. The existing pedestrian bridge would not be touched under this scenario. The trail corridor established in the easement would be reserved for future trail construction under a different project, but it would exist on site as shown in the previous maps. Because the scope of the construction activities is narrow, it would likely be constructed in less than 2 years. And the estimated cost to construct is about $3.2 million, assuming construction starts in 2025 and based on the current levels of conceptual design. Alternative 2, the side channel would require the most amount of excavation. Grading a gradual connected floodplain would cut into that reserved passive use area, and it would fragment that regional trail. The lower pedestrian bridge would have to be relocated and or replaced with a larger bridge under this scenario. The alternative would likely take more than 3 years to construct due to the complexity and the extensive grading on site. A conservative estimate cost to construct is about $8.2 million, assuming construction starts in 2025 again. The impacts to the reserved passive use area, the bridge location, the expensive cost are all potentially fatal flaws noted within the social and financial categories of the criteria matrix for scoring. The complexity of the project itself and the location of the groundwater on site increases the possibility of failure for this scenario and continued cost to the Park and Recreation Department over time for adaptive management. Alternative 3. This alternative would require a moderate amount of grading for the widening at the confluence relative to the other alternatives. During high flows, all channels of the multi-thread channel would contain flow, and during low flows, at least one at the lowest elevation would carry the flows. The start of the multi-thread channels would be downstream of the lower pedestrian bridge so that the lower bridge would not need to be removed or replaced under this scenario. Large woody debris and beaver dam analogs would be used to fix hard points within each of the channels to encourage threading instead of combining into a single channel in the future. This alternative will likely take about 2 years to construct, and the estimated cost is about $6.2 million, assuming construction starts again in 2025. Alternative 4. In addition to potential available stream channel with the alcove, this option also includes more floodplain reconnection than alternative 3. The lower pedestrian bridge, again, would not need to be removed or replaced in this scenario. The alternative would likely take about 2 years to construct, and the estimated cost is about $2.4 million, assuming, again, construction starts in 2025. Alternative 4 scored slightly higher than overall the others, and therefore is recommended now as the preferred alternative to carry forward. Here you can see the full picture of how each alternative scoring compared. You can see that alternative 4 scored just slightly higher than 1 and 3 and was therefore selected as the preferred alternative. As stated previously, this may shift based on inputs and feedback received. Next steps. So looking ahead, our stakeholder briefings and public engagement opportunities are going to continue throughout November, as we discussed, and it is anticipated that City Council will select their preferred alternative by January in order for us to move forward to preliminary design. Upcoming opportunities. So again, these stakeholder briefings are continuing. We have that online open house that will run through November 30th. And so please feel free to participate in that survey to make sure that your comments are registered. And then we are going to City Council on December 6th to discuss the preferred alternative and the selection criteria. So feel free to participate in that opportunity as well. And here's the contact information for myself, Amanda, and Rose. We'll be putting that into the chat so you can see those, along with the story map link, which will have that survey and all the information for you to check out after the discussion. And with that, we thank you so much for your time, and we'll now take questions. So we'll start looking at that Q&A section.
Our first question on here is, how do you know that alternative 4 will deliver $3 million worth of advantages over alternative 1?
So that's a good question. There's a couple of things I wanted to make sure that we mention is that all of the scenarios are going to be better than what's on site there now, right? So any one of these would be acceptable, and we look forward to moving forward on any one of the opportunities. Because we've got salmon habitat funding specifically for this with Chinook, they're going to be looking for more interaction at the confluence. They're going to be looking for more interception of groundwater, and so I appreciate the question about specifically $3 million worth, but basically what it comes down to is our ability to provide as much habitat as possible and, you know, as much benefit, and then also scoring high enough for grants, because again, this isn't going to move forward without full grant dollars. And so it's basically, it allows us the opportunity to provide as much habitat for as many species as possible, allow that interaction with people on the site, and provide that benefit for us to score well to receive grant funding. Rose, is there anything that you wanted to add on
that? No, I think you answered that well. And just to emphasize, so because of the grant funding aspect, if you look at the criteria matrix in more detail, alternative 1 has the least likely possibility of being funded because it doesn't target benefits down at the confluence, specifically restoration funding. There are other types of funding out there.
Right. So next question is, why do we need to wait until 2025? Couldn't it be started in 2024 or late 23? So good question. We have to move in specific steps in order to get through environmental permitting. And so that's why we're hoping that we get a decision by council in January, because it's going to take us several months to move them from the conceptual design phase to a preliminary design. And that's needed so that we can begin the permitting process with all of the agencies. There's a lot of interaction that needs to take place in order for us to be able to move forward. So we really won't be done with all of that work until the end of 2023. And then again, because grant funding is required, we need that preliminary design in order to go to the grant folks and say, hey, we need money for construction of this great project. And then they have to fund it. And so that's where the lag comes in, is we're hoping to get grant funding we'll be applying in February of 2023 with the hopes of getting it by 2025. So it's quite the lag when you're dealing with some of the grants and their funding cycles.
Our next question is, can you explain how Chinook will use this habitat and the importance of floodplain reconnection?
Certainly. Well, actually, Rose, do you want to start with this one? Excuse me, I'm just going to grab some water.
Sure. Yeah. So Chinook salmon use the corridor as adults for migration to get to spawning habitat up past Lake Sammamish. And then also when they out migrate, so 2 times a year, roughly. I mean, they're there more times of the year than not, but they have different life cycles different times depending on their life cycle stage. And then in terms of how they would use the site, so adult Chinook, we're not too worried about because they'll move through pretty quickly. And the main influence for them is how cool stream water is, because they're not going to swim to their spawning habitat unless the water is cool enough. So for that, cool water is important. For the juvenile Chinook, some of the severe impacts for them are with regards to the fact that the Sammamish River has very little connected floodplain or off-channel habitat now. So when there are heavy floods, they either get washed out or they're not going to go through the Sammamish River to out-migrate. And it also means that there's less opportunity for rearing because there's less places for them to sort of hunker down and eat food before they get big enough to swim out.
Right. Yeah. So basically the 2 stages. So we're providing cold water refuge while they're waiting to be able to go upstream, or we're getting the rain enough so that they can make it up into the smaller stream reaches. And then again, when they're migrating out or growing so that they can migrate out. Okay, next one. Could you please share timeline and budget for each option? Is there a table for this and how the funding is planned? So we don't have a table yet for this. This is still things that we're working on. Again, it depends on which alternative is chosen as to what type of grant funding that we can apply for. The timeline if all things were to align, we're hoping to go to construction in 2025. Alternative 2 will take at least 3 years to construct, so that would be through 2028. And the other alternatives will take 2 years or less. And so we're thinking that alternative 1 would take less than 2 years. That would be the quickest one. That would be done by 2027. Okay, next one. Did you consider alternatives with bridge replacement? Natural streams have migrating channels and the small existing bridge won't allow for that. So yes, replacement of a bridge would put this into a different environmental permitting category. And so we need to make sure that we're focused on the restoration and not any bridge replacement. However, Parks needs to access both sides of the park area. And so what we were trying to do was show scenarios that would allow the existing trails and bridges to exist. We do understand that in some of the alternatives, the hope is that the Parks and Recreation Department will be able to work with King County and either upsize those bridges or remove them, or whatever they need to do. But that is outside of our project scope, and we're specifically staying away from the bridge replacement because that will put us into a different permitting category.
Your next question is, how does the trail position and structure of the current bridges limit the scope of the salmon habitat designs?
So the trail position, again, we're not building the trail, we're just allowing for it under the project. And so what we have asked for Parks is to remove the trail as much outside of the buffer as possible. So again, once we move forward in preliminary design, we can have those conversations about where to plant and not, and what spaces to leave for that trail position. And limiting the scope of salmon habitat designs. Again, that's why we would say that bridge had to be removed in alternative 2 because it can't exist under the side channel. But we did try to make sure that we could maximize the habitat benefits within that area, the lower area, understanding that in alternative 3 and 4, we're hoping still that the bridge will be figured out by Parks and Rec before we actually move to construction, but we need to function under the idea that it might still be there. So the only alternative is alternative 2, where it has to be removed. The other ones that we're gonna focus on the project design as though it's there.
The next question, you discussed stakeholders, but I didn't hear anything about local tribal governments. How is this group working with local tribes to honor water and fishing rights?
Right. So the tribes are sovereign nations, and so we have to be very careful in how we reach out to them. So we reach out to them during the cultural resource, and then our real opportunity is during preliminary design. When we start the permitting and we work through with Army Corps, that is when the tribal communities come in and can really interact with us. It's very important to give them the respect, and so it's not a staff member to a tribal community. We have to be very careful and very intentional on how we reach out. But yes, that's absolutely part of the conversation, and will be definitely involved as part of preliminary design.
How will the potential widening of 96th Avenue and Waynita Drive affect the project?
So that will not affect the project at all. That's outside of our project scope.
Okay, there was a short mention of gardening, which I was curious about. I had sent an offline question, but it doesn't seem like those have been captured. There was a proposal for a community garden space in the front area, which I believe was not under consideration, but I wasn't sure why.
Okay, so what we had put into the story map was just an understanding of the constraints of the site. So what would be allowed under passive use, for example, outside of the buffer areas. And so we just mentioned opportunities, but again, that's going to be for Park and Recreation to decide what can go in on the site outside of the project areas. I would say with gardens, the one concern would be watering. And so it'll be a conversation that you should have with Parks and Recreation regarding if you're looking for a community garden space. It just has to have access to water on site.
Next question, are there any plans to try to capture, clean, and cool runoff from the housing developments in the Waynita Creek watershed that is currently piped directly to the Sammamish?
So not as part of this project. Again, salmon habitat restoration. And so that, I believe what you're talking about is the Piper's Glen that's directly pipes to the Sammamish River. We would likely not touch that as part of this. However, any of the plantings that we have, anything, you know, as far as Waynita Creek goes, we're going to be looking for natural ways to allow sedimentation to either move or be settled out within the system. And we're also looking outside of this project at stormwater. We can certainly be adding projects to the, you know, the capital facilities plan. We're also looking at some opportunities with parks on and everything from a stormwater park feature to deal with flow control and additional water quality for existing development. They probably will not be as part of this plan, though, again, because of the funding that we're going for and for the specific criteria.
Okay, the next question is multiple part question. I'll just read them one at a time. If you can see them on your screen as well, Janet.
Let's see, I can check.
Okay. So can aspects of one alternative be added to alternative 4, in essence, add some features?
So alternative 4 does have the alcove. And again, that one is coming in at almost 6.5 million. We will definitely in preliminary design be looking at things. For example, we'll be coordinating with permitting agencies. Can we add any, you know, floodplain community connection further with the Sammamish? Can we add, you know, large woody debris? There's other items that we'll definitely be looking at as part of preliminary design. But again, we will be focused on cost and how we'll be able to fund the project. So the other thing that I would mention is we were talking to UW and other biologists and ecologists for what other species can benefit in the area. And we're very excited during preliminary design to explore those opportunities.
Great. Also, same person asking, where is the grant funding coming from?
So again, it depends on which alternative is chosen. We are in communication with RIA 8 so that we can apply for surfboard funding. We're also looking at the PSAR funding opportunities. Depending on the floodplain reconnection, we're hoping that we can get some cooperative watershed funding from the King County Flood Control District. And then there's another pot of funding from the stream flow restoration grants with ecology. And so we have been in communication with them as well, with the hope that between those 4 sources that we'll be able to have enough funding in order to move forward. 4 grants is a lot, and it's a very big lift for us. And so we'd be very careful about adding other ones on there. But because there are 2 water rights on this property, and if we can give those back to ecology as part of this effort, that will help us score higher on the stream flow restoration grants.
How and when were the lines between the passive use area and the remainder of the 31 acres drawn?
So that would be a question for Parks and Recreation. I'm not sure how that was carved out. I just know that in the easements, in the acquisition documents, that portion was carved out, as well as the regional trail placement.
Which of these alternatives provides the best groundwater infusion for Chinook?
So Rose, I'm gonna push that one to you as well, but I would say that groundwater in all of these, because we had the 7 monitoring wells that we've been looking at, the groundwater actually gets closer to the surface the farther away you get from the Sammamish River. And so in all of those scenarios, let's look at 2, 3, and 4, I believe, we would be definitely connecting with those, but in 1 as well, we'd be looking at places that we can connect with the groundwater. I don't know if there's anything you want to add on that, Rose.
Right. So similar to what Janet's mentioning, across all the alternatives, reconnecting those 2 tributaries will help with clean water input, as well as encouraging groundwater interaction with surface water. The team will also be looking into where and how to place large wood material in Waynita Creek to encourage the type of cycling to get surface water and groundwater to cycle and get more groundwater into the surface water. And then also generally, the team thinks that for the alternatives with the most excavation, there's more opportunity to replace with materials that are more suited for groundwater surface water exchange. That's another opportunity. The caveat is that with alternative 2 in particular, because the side channel connects with the Sammamish River in its entirety, the potential cool water benefits could be balanced or not quite as visible, because some of the input to the side channel would be warm Sammamish River water. And that's not something we're anticipating as part of the alternative 4 alcove design, because alternative 4 alcove design would rely more on flows from groundwater and from Waynita Creek than the Sammamish River.
Okay, and what is being done to control or change the inflow of stormwater from Piper's Glen?
So again, Piper's Glen is directly discharged to the Sammamish River. And so that's not something that's part of this project scope. Again, we're going to be looking at stormwater projects outside of the salmon habitat restoration project to deal with existing developments. I will say that any newer projects are required to have water quality. And so newer projects coming in are not the ones that we're worried about, because they're required to detain deforested conditions and provide water quality benefit. Whereas some of the existing, that's when we were talking about like the stormwater park that we would look at potentially for the Front 9 area, would be able to capture a lot of runoff from sites that don't have adequate flow control and water quality.
All right, thank you, Janet. Next question, are there ways that design concepts from the side channel alternative could be integrated into other alternatives?
So I would say, again, when we're looking at preliminary design, however, the alcove for alternative 4 was the way that we would look at floodplain reconnection. If we're looking at the side channel, then we would go with the side channel option. But as far as the cost benefits and, looking at the existing alternatives, we'll be looking at how we can maximize the benefit once we move to preliminary design.
All right, thank you. Is there a short and long-term plan for the stewardship of the native plantings? Succession planning? I would hate to see failure due to longer drought conditions that we're seeing in the summer.
Right. So with any project, we will have to install temporary irrigation. And so once we would install the plantings on site, we would be maintaining those. Again, it'll depend on permitting, but most of the time we leave that till full plant establishment between 5 and 10 years. So we'll definitely be taking care of those in the short term. But then again, this is a parks and open space. And so there will be planning to make sure that we maintain those for the long term.
Okay, have the costs been compared to potential projects to provide comparable benefits to salmon at other locations?
Not really sure I understand the question.
Let me
I
see.
do.
Okay,
What's that,
Rose.
Rose?
Yep.
Yeah, so if I'm understanding, I think the question is trying to understand if there are other projects in the basin where we can compare costs to see if the alternatives are providing equivalent. And the answer is no, we're not, because when we're developing our cost estimates, we're developing using existing conditions today and projecting out to what we think they could be in 2025. And so really in terms of comparing between costs, that's typically something that, say, if we were to go for WIRA 8 surfboard funding, they'd be looking at across the basin to see what projects they think should receive funding because they have a limited pool rate. And then Janet, I think that's something that we could talk about if you'd like us to look at it. That's not something we've done currently.
No, and again, like you're saying, it's we have to look at each individual site, and we meet with the RIA 8 technical committee to go through all of these alternatives, and they were saying the same thing, that it's very site specific, and so we'd be looking at what will function on the site, what will provide the most benefit. And so we'll can be continuing to speak with them and with UW and with King County experts, several folks, to make sure that we are providing the appropriate cost benefit. And like Rose said, because we're already in communication with those folks, there's a good understanding of what we can do on the site and appropriate levels that we could be funded.
Okay, do any or all alternatives involve increasing the depth of the creek or streams?
So Rose, I know we've talked about this. I'll let you chat about how much we're, especially with the side channel, that's where we have a lot of concerns about the complexity. So I'll let you speak to that.
Right. So we will absolutely be affecting the dimensions of the creeks and the tributaries, because some of our alternatives involve new channels or, for example, reconnecting the tributaries. However, it's important to remind folks that we're only at about 10% design, and we haven't done hydraulic modeling yet, which means specifics with regards to dimensions, we're not there yet. So we can give you approximations, but nothing specific. And then what's driving most of our estimates is what we think it would take to excavate on average in reconnected floodplain areas and stream areas based on assessment of where groundwater levels are.
Right. And so for reference, when you were talking about averaging, some of the groundwater closer to the Sammamish was 15 feet down from the surface. And so there would be major excavation as part of that. Whereas when we get further back and towards Waynita Creek, towards those two tributaries coming in, some of it was, 5 feet down, that kind of thing. But we'd be looking at specific locations in order to capture that groundwater and, move things through as possible. Excuse me.
Next question, has there been consideration regarding maintenance of this area, the cost involved, the potential impacts of human use from river users and park users, and beaver activity altering the design?
Yes, absolutely. So that was one of the criteria in the matrix. And if it does have a higher maintenance and operations cost, it did score lower for that reason. And then we are, speaking directly, the Parks Board and the Parks staff with what we think is reasonable, and they'll be key to the preliminary design and through final design to make sure that those are being considered. As far as beaver activity, absolutely. We'll be talking with groups like Beaver Northwest and folks that have got really great information as far as, for example, where to place large woody debris and other things, for example, that they would be able to build on, understanding that they are going to be on the site and that they'll likely be building dams every 50 to 100 feet. And so where can we help them strategically place them? We'll also be working with Fish and Wildlife on a plan so that if they do build one in an area that isn't ideal, we'll be able to either notch or put in beaver deceivers, all different kinds of techniques that we'll be looking at in order to adaptively manage the site. As far as human use, that's where we're talking about where we're not building these items, but we're taking in consideration trail locations and other uses that might be on the site. And again, where we're not building them, we'll be working with parks to make sure that we either don't plant in those areas or that we're, providing the opportunities for people to actively use the site and enjoy the features that we're going to install.
Okay, next one's a terminology question. What is the meaning of riparian, hyporheic, and I'm sorry if I said that wrong myself, hyporheic connectivity and beaver dam analog?
Rose, I'll let you take those. Excuse me.
Absolutely. So hyporheic connectivity, also hyporheic exchange, refers to water transfer between surface water and groundwater. And so when we're talking about hyporheic connectivity, we're talking about the area that's usually right below the stream bed where you're getting a lot of that cycling of groundwater and surface water. Oh, right, and then beaver dam analogs. Apologies. So as the name suggests, they are devices that have been designed by humans to mimic beaver dams. And I'm afraid I don't have more than that, but if you Google it, there are some really cool pictures out there about what they look like. And in a sense, they're kind of intended to help foster beaver use where we'd like them to be, or to simulate functions that you would normally see with beavers. And as mentioned previously, in our designs in particular, they're ended to act kind of like large woody material structures to serve as hard points to encourage that meandering that we'd like to see for alternatives 3 and 4.
And the last one, the meaning of riparian.
Yes, sorry, I'm taking notes simultaneously. Okay, so riparian refers to the zones immediately adjacent to creeks that have influence on those creeks. So in Western Washington, for example, King County specifically, sometimes what's used is if a tall tree were to fall, would it land in the stream? That's approximately, in some senses, the zone of riparian influence by some definition. So when we're talking about the riparian zone, we're talking about areas adjacent to the stream that are influencing stream function.
Thank you, Rose. Our next question, is there a similar process underway for the west side of the park by the clubhouse? Will there be a similar meeting on this if there is?
So that again is going to be Parks and Recreation. So I'm assuming the Parks Board will be involved in those conversations. I'd have to refer to the parks just to see where they are. I'm not sure if it was added into the capital facilities plan or in their master planning process, but I'm assuming it's part of the PROS plan.
And the last question that we have as of right now is, if hydraulic modeling hasn't taken place yet, then how do you know about temperatures in the side channel?
So we have a side channel that's upstream, and we've been monitoring that since its installation in 2017. And so we are using adaptive management as far as taking that information from that site and making sure that we adaptively manage this site for what we're seeing there. The hydraulic modeling will show us where the flow is going. And what we are currently doing is taking measures on site. Amanda, do you want to talk about some of the monitoring that you're doing on site?
Sure, yeah. So I have been going out to the creek twice a month, and I've been taking surface water measurements, looking at turbidity, pH, dissolved oxygen, temperature. We have 2 temperature loggers on site, one near the confluence of Waynita Creek and one upstream near Waynita Road. And they have been recording temperatures all through the summer just to kind of see what we're coming through in that area. Also, I have begun doing quarterly flow monitoring in the area as well.
Great, thank you.
Those are all the questions that I'm seeing at this point. We still have about 15 minutes left. If you have more questions, please feel free to use the Q&A for that. I also wanted to ask you, Janet, is this a good time maybe to launch the poll? We have 3 questions, just quick questions in a poll.
That would be great.
Okay, I'll launch that. I see there's another question, so let me launch that and then I'll read that new question. Okay, this question is, I understand we should save our salmon or save the salmon just for cost versus benefits to residents wondering, what advantages does City of Bothell residents get by spending this $3 million? There's a couple parts to this question, so I'll start with that one. What advantages do City of Bothell residents get by spending this money on this project?
Oh, it's an interesting question. So the area right now is not being, it's just open space. And so while this will provide a lot of benefit for salmon and for other species that utilize the space, the benefits to the residents are going to be, one, because we're actually providing good habitat and a good environmental stewardship for the land, but we're also going to provide those opportunities for people to interface with the land. For example, they're talking about either like raised boardwalk areas or ways that you can actually see the stream. Right now, Waynita Creek, for example, is covered in blackberry and you can't really see it, and it's very steep slopes. And so we're going to create something that's not just better functioning, but more aesthetically pleasing. And so people will be able to utilize the space. I think it'll be a really nice, peaceful place. There's a lot of folks that are interested in bird watching, for example, and seeing some of these species in action, and you'll be able to do that on site. We're also going to provide habitat for some raptor species, and we're hoping to provide, there's a tree nearby that is going to have to be taken down that has an eagle's nest. And so we're hoping to provide habitat for that as an example within this site area if possible. There's a multitude of benefits, I really think, for folks to be able to utilize the space with themselves and their families.
Okay, another part of that question, are there other projects compared for the same amount of money that would provide a greater community benefit? I think the person is trying to get at how badly does this project need to be done? Just wondering if the money could be spent somewhere else for greater community benefit.
Right. So again, I would go back to the grant dollars. This area is being looked at in the region because it's one of the biggest parcels along the Sammamish River that's left. And so there's a lot of current support for a project on site here. So it would be important for us. That's why we wanted to make sure we move forward now while the funding possibility is there. Again, these are regional grant dollars that we would be able to bring into Bothell. They would not necessarily be able to be used for, something else in Bothell because they're specific to salmon habitat restoration. I would say, we could definitely not do the project. That's always an option, and we can, bring that to council, and they could say, we don't want to do this right now. But again, anything that we do on site is going to function better, both for animal and human species on site. So I would say it's going to be definitely a benefit for the community.
Next question, how much consideration is being given to coho and kokanee meats?
So a lot of the habitat features that we're looking at are also going to benefit coho and kokanee. We are talking again with UW, so we'll be interfacing with them during preliminary design to make sure there's considerations that we can look into. But again, the focus of the funding is on Chinook, and so we'll make sure that that we are meeting those requirements in order to obtain the necessary funding. But what benefits Chinook is going to benefit the other species.
Okay, regarding the cost of this project, I heard in this webinar that the alternative 4 would cost 2 or 3 million, but the cost on the website is 6.5 million. Can you help me understand the difference? Is the difference the amount that grants would pay for?
So what's on there is actually correct. So it would be 3.4 million, I believe, for alternative 1. Alternative 2 was I think it was 8.4, and then we're looking at 6.2 and 6.4 respectively for alternatives 3 and 4. So the alternative that would cost around 3 million was alternative 1.
All right. Another one, it says, I also want to highlight the fact that earlier in the presentation, it was mentioned that the vast majority of funding would come from outside grants and not out of the city budget.
That's correct. And we won't be able to move forward without that funding.
Right. Another comment, I volunteer with a local organization, Earth Corps, that trains and employs young people to do restoration work. Earth Corps often get paid by cities to do restoration work. How can Earth Corps get information about bidding on this project once it is closer to starting?
So we follow our standard process for construction, and a lot of times where we utilize services like Earth Corps is going to be in the maintenance phase, and so it would likely be after construction that we would interface with Earth Corps on potential project opportunities, but they can always put in a bid during a construction phase, which will be it'll be advertised in newspaper, on the website, and in our typical methods using the MRSC list, which they are on.
All right. How will the project contribute to replacing the functions of the wetlands that were lost when the lake was lowered?
So as we mentioned, there's 5 wetlands on site, and so we will be making sure that we restore those areas as needed within the buffers as well. And we're also going to be basically most of the site, except for that little tiny white triangle, is within the stream buffers and wetland areas. And so that's what we'll be focusing on for the restoration.
Okay, next question. Is it ironic that the Army Corps of Engineers dredges the slough to eliminate BDAs and we replace them in the creek? Your tax dollars are working both ways. I'm in favor of this project, but I may not be alive when it is finished. All right, let me see. Okay, a comment about Earth Corps is already helping with rechannelization on the Sammamish Trail by Bothell Landing. We appreciate that so much.
Yes, that's great.
Another question, UW Bothell and Cascadia College has a 25+ year restoration site on the same watershed that is considered to be very successful. Is there any relationship there to talk about best practices and or to share expertise?
Absolutely. So we met with the professors at UW as part of the stakeholder briefing process, and they are very excited to work with us during preliminary design. They're also excited to bring students out and do some of the monitoring with Amanda on site. And so there's going to be a lot of conversation back and forth with them to share lessons learned.
Okay, here's another question. How would alternative 2 contribute to rearing habitat differently than the other alternatives?
So that's a good question. Rose, I can have you chime in on this as well, but they're all going to have that interaction with groundwater. They're going to have the interaction with habitat creation. Really excited about alternatives 3 and 4 for that, because that braided channel allows for extended habitat opportunities. With alternative 2, again, you're going to have that floodplain reconnection, and you'd have extended opportunities for that off-rearing habitat. But again, because it's interfacing with the Sammamish River, we're just concerned about temperatures and making sure that it's actually moving, because we've had issues with the other side channel, specifically where it's been pretty cut off and it didn't interface with groundwater the way we thought it would. But Rose, I'll let you chime in on this as well.
Right, so Janet got it spot on. Alternative 2 provides a lot of great rearing habitat opportunity based on like the sheer surface channel availability and the floodplain connection work that would be happening. But that comes at added risk and added cost to do all the earthwork to create that connected floodplain and channel.
All right, last call.
I was going to say, since we've got 1 minute left, I just want to thank everyone so much for their time, and we're very excited to move forward with this project, and excited to move into preliminary design so that we can start answering a lot of these questions. Did want to remind folks to go to that story map link, review everything, and then please provide any other comments that you want to make sure are captured. And then even when you're talking about these other considerations, a lot of those we can take a look at as part of preliminary design. And when we're talking to the permitting agencies, what other things can be installed on site. So this is just the beginning of the conversation, and looking forward to moving on once we have a preferred alternative. So thanks again, and I hope you all have great evenings, and anything we didn't get to, please feel free to put it on the story map.
There was one last question on here asking if we could save a list of these questions on the website. I believe we're compiling a list of questions that we've received, as well as the responses from the story map survey. So Janet, do you want to speak to that?
Certainly. So we're going to be gathering those all the way through November, and then we'll be capturing those, compiling some for council, but also the comments will be part of the final report when we move forward from the preferred alternative. So you'll be able to see those. And then Christy, you're recording this as well, correct?
I am. Yeah, I'm hoping that technology works as planned and I can get this uploaded to our website, which hopefully will be functioning by tomorrow morning. And then also I'll put a link on the story map to this recording too. There's one last question. Curiosity. Do you know when and who has named Waynita Creek, or is it just a local reference? I don't know the answer to that.
That is a good question. We'd have to go back and look. So when we started doing our stream delineations, that we started to capture existing names that were already there. And so for the most part, it was either the community that was, connected to the area, or directly related to development, project or that type of thing that was located. There was a couple that did get named based on activities on site, but I'd have to look into it. So we'll definitely find out, and maybe we can even post that on the website.